Thank you, Andrew, for that children's story. And I appreciated that Andrew and I seem to be on the same wavelength. If you noticed, he was actually showing those children the pinnacle of technology, and it was an Apple iPhone. Thank you, Andrew, for teaching our children from a very young age the right direction when it comes to technology. Have you ever been in the car? Maybe you're driving to work, driving to visit someone, just in the car, and you're parked at a traffic light that is on a bit of a slope. Have you ever done that? Now, if you're starting to just drive a manual car, it's a scary experience, isn't it? And you look in the mirror, hope there's no one behind you, hand on the handbrake. But no, you know how to drive and everything's going well, and you're at the traffic lights, and there's a car that pulls up next to you. It stops, and then as you're minding your own business, all of a sudden, the car next to you appears to be going backwards. Have you ever had that happen? And you're there, and all of a sudden it feels like what's happening to you. It feels like you are moving. Have you ever had that happen? And what do? I know what I do. You just tighten your grip around your steering wheel and just slam on the brakes. And then you realize that the guy probably had a manual car and was just sloping backward before accelerating. And you feel really foolish, right? And if your kids are in the car, you have to try to explain it somehow to them that you're okay. Mummy's all right. Daddy's, hasn't gone crazy. What is that effect that makes us feel like we're moving when in reality we're not moving? How many of you know the pair up on the screen? If you watch the news or read Women's Weekly, you definitely know them. But I'm sure many of us have seen them on the news. John F. Kennedy Jr. It was a big story on the news going around 13, 14 years ago. Some of you may remember that. John F. Kennedy Jr., this is JFK's son, along with Carolyn Bessette and Carolyn's sister Lauren, got in a small Piper Saratoga, a small airplane, and I think Paul might know a little bit more about what these airplanes do, to travel a short domestic trip in America. Now, JFK Jr. didn't have instrument ratings. That means he didn't know how to read instruments properly. It was only supposed to fly below the clouds. And when you're a relatively inexperienced pilot, I'm told that you generally avoid flying over water at night. Why would you do that? Because at night there are no lights, you can't see anything, and it's hazardous for your health and possibly life. Now, JFK, no instrument training, decided to fly over a large body of water, and it was at night, July 16, 1999. Only a couple of hours later, lost all radio communications with the towers in the nearby vicinity, and for those of you that watch the news, you know that the airplane went down into the sea. JFK Jr., his wife, and his sister-in-law died instantly. Now, if you were to look up the National Transportation Safety Board report on that incident, there's a small sentence that after months of investigation determines what the issue of that crash was. Does anyone remember what that might have been? It was big news 13 years ago. They used to call it pilot vertigo. Have you heard of that phrase before, or vertigo? But now they call it spatial disorientation. And looking at the radar tracking, how his plane was going and then eventually coming down to the sea, they discovered that JFK most likely experienced spatial disorientation. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I'm told that in the vestibular system, in the part there that creates sound and balance, there's some fluid that actually flows between these various bits and pieces, and see a doctor for more information. And what that fluid does is it actually creates our sense of balance, which is when you have an ear infection or when you hear a loud explosion, that may affect that even temporarily. You may be disoriented and you might shuffle and stumble. Now, Army Air Force Corps Captain William Ocker in 1927 was sitting on a chair that would spin around. You know, the kind, I mean, most office chairs do that now. He was maybe in a dental chair or something, and he was spinning with his eyes closed. And then all of a sudden, he stopped the chair, and if you've ever sat on one of those chairs that's spinning and you stop it, what do you feel is happening to you? You're still spinning, maybe in a different direction, maybe you start to get dizzy, and then if you open your eyes and try to walk, how do you walk? You sort of do the crab shuffle. And what William Ocker discovered is that our instinct, our feelings, our emotions, our perception of reality, of balance, of where we are, can be impacted and negatively affected by a spinning chair, something very simple. And he went back and told his superiors in the Army Air Force that pilots had to rely on instruments alone, not on their gut feeling, not on their instincts, not on their emotions, not on their brains. That was the motto, brains and instinct in the Air Force. That's what you flew on. But William Ocker said, no, we have to rely on instruments above brains and instincts. And do you know what the Air Force did to him? Twice they tried to hospitalize him because they said he was insane. But eventually, after further study, they discovered that indeed he was right, and the instruments, the gyroscopes, and all the bits and pieces in an aeroplane instrument panel were more accurate than brains and instincts, because under certain circumstances, like when you're spinning in a chair, the fluid in your vestibular system moves to a point where you might feel like you're going up when you're going down, you might feel like you're stationary when in fact you're going to the right or to the left, and what happens inside the mind, the brain, the emotions, the instinct, the feelings may be very inaccurate to what is happening to your airplane. And if you need further information, I'm sure Paul here would be able to share with you about flying and pilot's vertigo and spatial disorientation. Now, researchers in the Air Force today are telling us that up to 20% of Air Force pilots continue to die and lose 20, 30, $40 million airplanes because of spatial disorientation, to the point where the American Air Force and probably the Australian one have implemented a system where if the pilot does nothing to save an aircraft heading straight to land, the pilot will lose all control and autopilot will kick in. And it's not to do with the pilot, it's to do with the $40 million airplane that the Air Force wants to save. And what they're saying is that you have 30 seconds as a pilot to correct the issue, to look to your instruments, to stop relying on that gut feeling, on your sense of balance. You've got 30 seconds. If within 30 seconds you don't do something, you don't look at the instruments, you don't pull out and follow the instruments instead of your gut feelings, it's over. 30 seconds. It might take another 2-3 minutes until you hit water, until you hit land, until you hit something else, but 30 seconds to stop trusting your inner gut, your instinct, your experience, your feelings, your sense of balance, your vestibular system, and to start trusting the instruments. Why? Well, you know, the Air Force have made a groundbreaking discovery. We were not created to fly. Amazing. We were created to walk. Now, sure, we can fly, and that's not a problem, but because our body isn't designed to fly, when we get in an airplane and certain funny things happen to the vestibular systems, we become spatially disorientated. And to address this lack of built-in gyroscopes for flying, we have instruments external to us that don't love you or hate you, they just tell you the truth. They tell you your situation, your status, your condition, your balance, where you are, and you have a choice, take it or leave it. Can you imagine a pilot looking at his gyroscope and saying, that insensitive instrument, it always tells me I'm wrong? Yeah, sure, you can imagine a pilot doing that. They're the 20% that after years of training, the highest levels in the US Air Force continue to die, destroy $40 million machines. Why? They trust themselves rather than these neutral instruments. Now, you know, when you and I were created, believe it or not, you and I were not created for sin. We were not created for death. We were not created for selfishness, for sorrow, for pain, for suffering. We were not created for any of these things. And because we weren't created for these things, we didn't arrive with an instruction manual or built-in mechanisms to deal with sin, with selfishness, with sorrow, with death, with suffering, with oppression, with injustice. We simply weren't created for that. We were created for peace, for love, for harmony, for joy, for an environment of unconditional sharing, of togetherness, of community. That's why we were created for. But you and I know that something went wrong. Won't go into the details. And ever since, each one of us are in the pilot seat of an evacuation mission. An evacuation mission to transition, to navigate, to make it through this world, hopefully come out on the other side, bruises, scars, and pain and suffering, but definitely make it to the other side and eternity. Now, every pilot knows before you get into an airplane, you need what? How many of you have ever flown an airplane? A couple. Before you flew an airplane, not flying in an airplane, actually controlling the airplane, what would you need to do? Have you ever seen pilots walking around with these big briefcases? What are they? They're pre-flight checkbooks and they're flight manuals. Before you even think about flying, read the book. Get to know the aircraft, actually get some skills, learn how to fly the thing. And I just couldn't help this one, but you know, they no longer carry these heavy suitcases. But they still have a flight manual, only now it's on an iPad. Now that's the basic instruction before you even get into an airplane. And you know, God, especially after the fall of humanity, after sin and selfishness and death and sorrow, has given us an amazing instruction manual. And I like what they share with the children sometimes. Bible stands for what? Anyone? What does the acronym Bible stand for that you learn in primary, in junior? Bible stands for basic information or instructions before leaving earth. And that is what God has given us, basic instructions before leaving earth. They're definitely not comprehensive instructions, are they? If you wanted comprehensive instructions, you'd hope for more than just a book. But they are all we need to evacuate safely as we go through life's journey. But every now and again, and I'm not sure about you, but it's more than every now and again for me, you go through trials, through storms, through difficult times where those basic instructions seem very good, but you need something else in an airplane, don't you? You need various instruments that don't teach you how to fly the airplane, but are relevant to your immediate context, to your current situation. And as we think about instruments, God has given us basic instructions before leaving earth, the Bible. But has He given us something that allows us to navigate through life's storms, through crises, through trials, and through the times that we live in that are unlike any other in history? Has God given us something significant, relevant, direct to our circumstances? If He has, what is it? And how can we interpret, understand, use these flight panel instruments God has given us? Now, to uncover that question, I'd like to introduce you to Antipas. How many of you have heard the name Antipas before? Now, this isn't the Antipas in Revelation. This is the first Antipas mentioned in the Bible, and he's actually quite a famous Antipas because his first name was Herod Antipas. One of the Herods anyway. And I'd like to share with you a little bit about Herod's story and the flight instruments that God had been giving him. Before we look at Herod's life, I want to share a little bit of background, how Herod Antipas got to be where he was. Now, all of us, especially in primary, junior, early teen, learn the books of the Bible. And if you follow the chronology, something interesting happens in the Bible. You get to Malachi, and when was that written? 4th, 5th century BC, and then you've got more than 400 years till you get to Matthew. Have you ever wondered what happened during that time? I certainly did. 400 years without something in the Bible, it almost seems strange to skip over that entire period. And this, what historians call intertestamental period, is important to getting to know Herod Antipas and his story. The Jews, we know, returned from Babylon, went to Jerusalem and began to rebuild the temple. And there were a couple of prophets, especially the last three. There was Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, prophets that spoke to the people that were rebuilding the temple. And if you read those books, you discover that the people came back with a different attitude returning from Babylon. Were they going to follow idols? No, they were not going to follow idols. They were not going to sacrifice their children. Were they doing what God really wanted them to do generally? No, they didn't worship idols. They didn't eat unclean foods, but their hearts were still quite selfish, self-centered, and wicked. God sends these prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and a few others, and the people read, receive the messages, but they don't seem to do a lot with them. During this period, if you remember the statue in Daniel 2, there's the Babylonian Empire, there's the Persian Empire, and who comes on the scene with a third empire? Alexander the Great. Alexander comes on, conquers the world, imposes some form of his own Greek-based religion and philosophy, but the Jews are allowed to worship in peace. They're a unique people, they're an ancient people, they're allowed to worship as they want. Alexander dies at a young age, and what happens to his empire? Well, the generals fight. Eventually 4 generals remain, and you've got Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus, and Ptolemy down there in Egypt. The empire divides into 4 Greek generals that continue to oversee matters of the kingdom. There's one particular general or line of generals called the Seleucids that controlled the area that surrounded or that included Jerusalem and Judea. The Seleucids, what do we know about the Seleucids? There's a particular Seleucid king that had a lot to do with the Jews. Does anybody know his name? Antiochus Epiphanes. And Epiphanes was supposed to mean, does anyone know what an epiphany means? You ever had one? An enlightened one, an enlightenment, right? And his name wasn't Epiphanes, but he gave it to himself, you know? He was a very modest man, you can tell. You know, you can... Anyway, Antiochus Epiphanes wanted to conquer, again, the world, as most of these generals did, came to Judea and wanted to force them to worship as he instructed, as he wanted. The Jews obviously were quite rebellious. He began a major campaign against the Jews, killed many of them, brought in an altar to one of his own gods, and actually sacrificed a pig in the temple at Jerusalem. How do you think the Jews felt about that? Horrendous. They called it the abomination of desolation. That was just a horrendous experience for them. They would go through town after town after town and make the Jews offer unclean animals to pagan gods. How do you think the Jews reacted? Well, most of them said no. There was obviously those that did comply. There's a story of one particular Jew. His name was Mattathias. And one of Antiochus's officers, came through to this little village and said to Mattathias, who was the leader of that village, you must offer sacrifice to a pagan god, some unclean animal. Mattathias said, you know, you can kill me, but I'm not doing that. And as he was talking, another one of the Jews from the same village went ahead, picked up the animal and sacrificed it to the pagan god. Now Mattathias, he was enraged. And what do you think he did to the Jew who had betrayed the faith? Took matters into his own hands, killed that Jew, killed the king's officer, and expelled all the pagan officers from that village, and began really a rebellion. Him and his sons, he had 5 sons, ran away into the mountains, and Antiochus and his armies continued to pillage Jewish villages. Now, when Antiochus and his army would come through, they wanted to make sure they had an easy victory. And what is probably one of the best ways or the best time to attack a Jew? Sabbath. Because Jews don't fight on Sabbath. So Antiochus would have 6 days off in his armies, or at least marching to these Jewish cities and villages. They would get there on Sabbath, they would march through and just massacre men, women, children, everyone in their path. Now Mattathias and his 5 sons and a couple of others said, you know, we just can't have this. This is not right. We're going to retaliate. Doesn't matter what day of the week it is. So Mattathias and his sons began a rebellion, a campaign against Antiochus and the Seleucids. Mattathias' son, Judas Maccabeus. Does that name ring a bell? In the Apocrypha, there are some books, the Maccabees, about one of Mattathias' children. Judas Maccabeus and his children and his grandchildren continued to rule and dominate Jewish affairs for quite some time. They expelled the Seleucids and really regained much of the territory that belonged to the Jews. Following this Maccabean revolt, the people in charge of Jerusalem were Mattathias' children, Judas, his son, grandchild, and so on. And they continued to dominate, as I mentioned. But around AD 50, there was an Idumean man by the name of Antipater. Now, Antipater was an Idumean, which meant he was from the territory of Edom, and Judas Maccabeus and the family had forced all the surrounding tribes to convert to Judaism. And Antipater was one of these Edomites who had converted to Judaism, or his ancestors had converted, and he became a high official, second to the ruling Jewish great-grandson of Mattathias. Now Antipater didn't necessarily like that his family had been forced into worship, and through a very cunning, deceitful maneuvers, he soon became governor of the area and overthrew the Jewish king or governor there. And he called himself a Jew, so that people respected him. But he became the governor of that area, and he appointed two of his sons in charge of the area of Judea. Faisal he appointed in Jerusalem, and his second son, by the name of Herod, he appointed over Galilee. Now this Herod that was appointed, we know as Herod the Great, who was a warm, fuzzy, loving man, right? He was a horrendous man. He married a number of wives. He had multiple children. That's just some of them up here on the screen. And he was cruel, barbaric, a maniac. He was maybe obsessive compulsive. He was a tyrant. He was a dictator. He was depressed. And he was paranoid. Recipes for what kind of king? A wonderful king, right? He was so suspicious that, let me explain the key here. If you see anything in red, that means he killed them. If you see anything in purple, they were banished. Banished his first wife, banished his third wife and her son, killed his second wife, whom he apparently loved, killed his firstborn, killed his secondborn, killed his thirdborn. And why do you think he did that? Bad hair days? No, there was suspicion in the court that maybe these sons were going to overthrow him on the throne. He was a despot. He was an evil man. The only ones that survived were Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Herod Philip II, which we're going to come to in a minute. And a couple of the others were left very small inheritances and asked to leave the realm. Now, maybe you can understand why in 4 BC there is rumor of another king. Now, this was the same year that Herod actually died. We know that he had kidney failure. He actually had, and I don't know the technical term, but he had infection and worms within his body. I mean, he was a very sick man in 4 BC about the time that the Magi are coming through. He is almost ready to die. And when the Magi come through, and there's a rumor, and there's some prophecy that the priests all know about, can you understand why Herod the Great takes matters into his own hands, even though he's on his deathbed? But you know, the Bible is not the story about Herod the Great. It's a story about God. And this theme repeats again and again. Why is the story of Herod the Great killing these children in the Bible? It is a story about God's incredible mercy and love. Here is a despot. Here is a tyrant. And what does God do for him? He sends 3 wise men, or at least we think it was 3, from the east to prick conscience, to awaken an understanding that there is a God. God in his love tries to reach even Herod the Great on his deathbed. Let's open our Bibles and read a little bit more about the story. And we haven't got to Herod Antipas yet, but it helps us to understand who Herod Antipas actually was. Matthew, first book in the New Testament, Matthew and chapter 2. We're not going to read the entire chapter, but we're going to skip through a couple of verses. Matthew chapter 2. We're going to read verse 1 to 3 as an introduction. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, this is King Herod the Great, who was literally on his deathbed, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people, chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. Amazing. Here is a man about to die, and he wants to know if there's anybody that could threaten his throne. And amazing that when he asked the priests and the Pharisees, what do they tell him? They know the answer, don't they? Amazing. They say, in Bethlehem, go that way. And amazing, have you ever thought why the star stopped over Jerusalem? God is so good that he stops a star in Jerusalem so that the wise men come through in a last-ditch attempt by God to reach Herod the Great, to reach the priests and the rulers that were there. An amazingly loving, good, merciful God after everything we read about this despot. Let's keep reading, verse 12. Having been warned in a dream, what had happened? Wise men had gone to Bethlehem. They'd seen the baby, and they go back to tell Herod the good news that they found the king. Verse 12, having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. And Herod doesn't hear from them for a while, realizes something has gone wrong. How did they know? Again, you see God trying to reach through to Herod with signs, with some way of saving this man before he dies. Joseph and Mary escape before the massacre comes through. Verse 16 to 22. When Herod realized that he'd been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Verse 19. After Herod died, historians tell us it was a cruel, it was a painful, agonizing death. Yet God had tried to intervene. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, go to the land of Israel. Those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." He got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. When Herod the Great died, there was a bit of a conflict, a fight over his will. And he had appointed Archelaus, who is mentioned there, as main heir, but two of the other brothers wanted some territory to rule over. So they all went to Caesar, and Caesar divided the land of Israel into three. Archelaus, who is mentioned there, got the largest portion, Idumea, Judea, Samaria. Herod Antipas, the guy we're getting to in a minute, got Galilee and Perea. And Herod Philip II actually got basically east of the Jordan, Bantana, up in that area there. Archelaus, who actually got the largest share and he was heir to the throne, was promised by Caesar that if he behaved, he would be given more territory. And do you think he behaved? He killed left, right, center, hundreds, thousands of priests, of Pharisees. He was as much a tyrant as his father. By 6 AD, Caesar removed Archelaus, banished him, and appointed Roman governors instead. That's why when Jesus is brought to trial, there's no governor or Jewish person there. Who's in charge? Pilate. Rome takes full control of this large area here. But Herod Antipas is allowed to have Galilee and Perea, which is why at Jesus' trial, Pilate sends him to who? To Herod Antipas, who is overseeing Galilee. Now, what do we know about Herod Antipas? He was the son of Herod, and all of them were called Herod, so it gets a bit confusing when you're doing history. That's why they have a second name. Herod Antipas, he ruled for more than 40 years in Galilee and that area there, the Decapolis, and he tried to do what was right. He seemed to be a semi-decent king. He built a lot of buildings. He wasn't a half-bad guy, and the people didn't complain about him as much as about his father or some of his brothers. Now, Herod was on a trip to Rome where he met his brother, Herod II. Now, it gets confusing. You don't have to remember Herod II. But he meets one of his brothers who has a new bride. Her name is Herodias. While in Rome, they meet, and it's love at first sight between Herod Antipas and Herodias, which is his brother's wife. To cut a long story short, Herod Antipas divorces his wife. We wanted to kill her first, but she ran away, so it ended up being a divorce. And steals his brother's wife, who was quite happy to comply to the affair and to be given probably a little bit more territory than what her first husband had. Now, just to put it into perspective, this is a very messed up family tree. This sounds like Bold and the Beautiful, Days of Our Lives. You name it, this is the story of Herod. I mean, that's where they get those storylines. Do you think they come up with them? No, they read the Bible and then they just change names. Bob, Jim, Alexander, Herod. No, I can't use Herod. Okay, now Herodias was the daughter of Aristobulus. Who's Aristobulus? One of Herod's boys that were killed by Herod. Herodias ends up marrying this guy here, Herod II, who happened to be banished or exiled by his father along with his mother. And when Herod Antipas goes to Rome, he stays with Herod II, meets Herodias, love at first sight. Now notice the guys in green are the guys that actually got territory. This one's banished. So when Herodias finds this, strapping young uncle of hers, she decides to elope. She leaves this guy who's banished, who probably doesn't have a lot of wealth or influence. She switches ships and goes off with Herod Antipas. An amazing story of intrigue, and it only gets messier. We won't go into all the details, but there's a story that gives us some more insight into Herod Antipas and Herodias. Let's go to Mark chapter 6, verse 18 to 20. Mark chapter 6. Now, we are familiar with this story, but when we start to get to know the characters, the story makes a lot more sense. Mark chapter 6, we're reading verse 17. We'll read verse 17 and 18. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." All of a sudden, on the Jewish scene, there's been 420, 30, 50 years of no prophets. Why? Well, people hadn't been following what they'd already been given. There'd been this period of no direct divine intervention. And as if out of the blue, there's a hairy man that comes on the stage. Well, that's how he seems to be described. But he wore camel's hair, typical garb of the prophet, which meant that he didn't live in luxury. He lived down in the deserts and ate locusts, and they weren't those little things that fly. They were probably some sort of desert pear that grew even in dry circumstances. And John the Baptist comes on the stage. Why does John the Baptist come on the stage? We know that it is to prepare, but when we think of prophets, there's one thing that comes to mind. Prophets come to tell everybody how bad they are, to point a finger. And if there was a prophet in the church at Erina, you know what we would be tempted to do? I think Arimba needs some support. Hey, Hans Deal is a boy next Sabbath, right? Why? People feel very cautious, very afraid, because all prophets seem to do in the Bible is point a finger and tell people how bad they are. And as you can see, Herodias feels how? No different. Why did God send John the Baptist? The Bible says that God is love. And God sees Herod, abusive, horrible circumstance. Can you imagine living with a father who could execute you at any given moment? Well, what would that be like growing up? So what's your dad like? He's pretty good. Do you have any brothers and sisters? Had. What happened to them? They're gone. It'd be a horrible upbringing. But there's a little bit of a desire in Herod Antipas' heart, and God sends John the Baptist, among other things, to reach Herod Antipas. And his message is not one to make him feel guilty or to condemn him, but it's one of hope. You're doing the wrong thing. Like instruments, you're flying upside down, you're about to hit the water. Gyroscope, hello. Self-destruction, 30 seconds away. That's why God sends John the Baptist, not to just make people feel uncomfortable. That's not God's purpose and plan, but to seek and to save. Let's keep reading. Verse 19, so Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to. Why? Because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. And here is an amazing story about God trying to reach someone. Can you imagine if you're about to go in the wrong direction and God sends a messenger to speak to you on his behalf? I mean, how would you respond? How would you feel? That God loves you so much that he sends someone to speak to you about things in your life that he wants to save you from. Would you hit the instrument and say, bad instrument, I know what I'm doing, I've got my brains, I've got my guts, I've got my feelings, I've got my instincts? Crash. No. God is trying to save Herod Antipas. Now, this is where Herod Antipas behaves in an interesting manner that I think we can sometimes relate to. What does it say Herod's attitude towards John was? Fear. He liked to listen to him. He wanted to hear what this man had to say. We see a deep reverence for John the Baptist. On one hand, though, while there is that reverence and that fear for John, what or how does Herod behave on the other hand? Revere, fear, but irrelevant. That's why our sermon is titled Reverent Irrelevance. Yeah, this is good. He's a man from God. Herodias, don't kill him. This guy's from God. He's from God, but you don't listen to him. He's from God, but you don't follow the messages that God has for you. Sure, I revere him, but maybe he's irrelevant. That's okay. I know what I did, and I have my excuses and my reasons for doing it. I don't want someone to tell me my mistakes, my sins. I don't need a gyroscope, and I'm flying an airplane, thank you very much. I can see very well in bad weather at night over a sea of water. We're not going to read the rest of the story, but you know what happens. Herod throws a banquet. Salome, who was also one of his sort of nieces in between that mix, incredible incest within that family, comes dancing, alluring, sensuous, captivates Herod's attention, and he makes a rash decision. He offers her anything and everything that she wants. And she goes and asks Mum. Can you imagine being married to Herodias? You know, the next door neighbors have the music up too loud. She sends you with an axe. It's just a horrible woman. And Herodias says, I want the head of John the Baptist. An amazing story. You know, we might revere the prophets, but if we excuse them as irrelevant, doesn't matter how much we revere them, our end is self-destruction. You know, only a couple of years later, maybe 1, 2 at the most, there's not a story where Herod Antipas comes on the scene. And we mentioned it earlier, Luke chapter 23, verse 8 to 11. Luke chapter 23, verse 8 to 11. Why don't we read from verse 6 to provide the background? Verse 6, on hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learnt that Jesus was under Herod Antipas' jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw this, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some miracle. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this they had been enemies. God had done everything possible to save Herod Antipas, even so much as sending a personal courier, an SMS if you like, an email, to Herod Antipas. And he rejected. Sure, he revered, he gave lip service, he appreciated listening to, but he ignored the prophet. Reverent irrelevance. And when Jesus comes along, why doesn't Jesus say anything to Herod Antipas? There's nothing left to say. What more could Jesus say that would change the mind of Herod Antipas, who had had a good start seemingly, went downhill because instead of relying on the instruments, God communicating to him through John, instead of relying on his flight manual, the Jewish scriptures, he begins to rely on his instincts, on his feelings. Oh, she looks good. Oh, I have power. I can take her. I'm in control. I know what I'm doing. And what was Herod Antipas' end? What happened to him eventually? You know, God had tried. Even for despots, even for tyrants, even for kings who disobey him, God tries. A couple of years later, Herodias' brother, an amazing story of intrigue. Herodias' brother, who happened to be Herod Antipas' nephew, so we're all related, went to Caesar. The story is long, but went to Caesar and told Caesar that his uncle was a traitor, that his uncle had formed an allegiance with some other powers, that his uncle was going to rebel against Caesar. And what do you think Caesar did? Do you think he paid much attention to that? He sure did. Because Agrippa, now there's a familiar name, isn't it? Agrippa, Herodias' brother, had favor with Caesar, and Caesar deposed Antipas, sent him to Gaul. Where's Gaul? Does anyone know where Gaul is? France. Now the Eiffel Tower hadn't been erected then. You didn't go to France on holidays. It was a place of exile. Together with his wife Herodias, they were exiled there, barren desert wasteland. They came to the end. What was God doing? God didn't hate Herod Antipas. God loved him so much that he intervened in world affairs to reach this man through a prophet, through a direct message that spoke to his heart, to his conditions, while he was piloting his own journey, his own evacuation mission. And you and I are in that same situation, in that same seat. You and I have choices to make. You and I have incredible challenges on a daily basis. Whether it's relationships, whether it's parenting, whether it's health, whether it's career, whether it's finances. You and I are going through a storm in life every day. And it's a dark storm because we can't see the future, can we? Don't know what tomorrow holds. I don't know what next week holds. What instruments has God given us? Now, I'm going to spend a very brief amount of time on this, and I assume before you were baptized, someone studied and shared this with you, so I'm just skipping it through quickly. But in Revelation chapter 12, right at the end, it describes the great controversy between God, between Michael, between Lucifer, the devil, and it describes this period of the Middle Ages, intense conflict for more than 1,260 years. And right at the end, it says the devil is angry and he goes to make war with the woman, with the offspring, the remnant, who have what? If you read that verse, it says, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Now, I've looked this up in dictionaries because there's various definitions. There is no argument that it should be testimony of Jesus Christ, which actually replicates itself just a couple of chapters later. Towards the end of the book, the second coming is described in glorious terms, and in Revelation 19, verse 10, an angel appears to John. And how does John respond to that angel? What would you do if a majestic, angelic being just arrived in your bedroom one night? How would you respond? I tell you what, I wouldn't be saying, have a seat, I'm watching telly, give me a few minutes. No, with awe, and John does the very thing. John chapter 19, verse 10, at this I fell at his feet to worship him, but he said to me, do not do it. I am a fellow servant with you and with your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Same phrase. Same phrase. And then he goes on to describe how Jesus interacts with his people, what that actually means. For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. What does that mean? It means that God loves humanity so much that he doesn't send us just with a flight manual. He doesn't say, take your iPad loaded with instructions, but he says, I want to give you instruments that can guide you, especially in the darkest times of Earth's history. I want to speak to you in a way that is relevant to your context, to your situation, to where you are, so that you don't spiral out of control, so that you don't get spatial disorientation, so that when it matters most, you don't self-destruct. And I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. And for most of us here, you'd be familiar with the photo up on the screen. God trying to connect with you and I. God giving us instruments for the times that we live in. You know, every time we talk about prophets, people always have a problem with a messenger. Did people have a problem with John the Baptist? How many people listened to him? The majority? No. How many people spoke up for him in Herod's banquet hall when it was about time to execute John? How many? How many of the officials, the rulers, the priests, they were all there? How many? Not one. What was John? Was John anything significant? It wasn't who he was as a person, it was what God was doing through him. And every time we talk about Ellen White, people have issues and problems and hang-ups and all sorts of things. She was human. No different to you and I, no different to any other person that God has used throughout history to reach people. But what she stood for and what she represented is God trying to interact with humanity. And when we revere the messages that God gives us, but refuse to pay heed, pay any attention, we are doing no different to what Herod Antipas is doing. We have John the Baptist in jail and we like to listen to him, but irrelevant, you know? Different culture, different context, different time. And I want us to spend 2 minutes looking at how to use the instruments that God has given. And there are going to be lots of instructions. You're welcome to write them down. The first instruction, to read. And you know how many more instructions there are after this one? That's it. That's it. Read what God has given. Simple. Don't read what's on the internet. There are answers to everything on the internet, so don't be too concerned about that. Just read for yourself. Where do you start? Have you ever read The Desire of Ages? Start there. The most incredible book that brings Jesus to life in a way you would have never seen before. Read the history of the great controversy, starting with patriarchs and prophets and kings. Move along to Acts of the Apostles, the great controversy. How young is too young to read the great controversy? I was 7 when my parents read stories from the great controversy. Do you think I understood everything? Absolutely not. Do you think it impacted my life for eternity? Absolutely. You're never too young to hear stories of what God has done in the history of humanity. Read Steps to Christ, which I've encouraged you to do before. Testimonies to the church. Are you part of the church? That means you. That means me. These are not messages of hate, of anger. Sure, read them in context. Sure, use a little bit of common sense. Sure, do a bit of digging and research and homework. Make sure we understand them right, but read. And if we refuse, if we leave them on the shelf, or, let me see if I've got it, on your iPhone, you can get the entire writings, the Spirit of Prophecy, on your iPhone, on your iPad. And do you know how much they cost? Nothing. Zero. How much easier can God make it? These aren't the messages of Ellen White. This is God trying to interact with you and I, giving us a gyroscope, flight instruments for the last times to keep us in balance, to keep us the right way up, to keep us heading steady on our evacuation mission. There's a story I'd like to finish. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 20. Jehoshaphat is going to war. It looks like a resounding defeat. But Jehoshaphat prays, and God sends a prophet and says, you will conquer if you follow my instructions. And Jehoshaphat leads the army to war, but before he does, what does he say to his people? Believe the Lord and his prophets, and you will prosper. You know, God wants you and I to prosper. Every aspect of our life. Every aspect. He's given us an incredible flight manual, the Bible. But he's given us some instruments that are relevant, applicable, valuable for our times. And his invitation to you and I is very simple. Read. Believe, and you will prosper. Why would you want to reject God wanting you to prosper? Believe the Lord and his prophets, and you will prosper.